Coming up on this week's podcast, has McLaren created its own intra-team problem? Is Max Verstappen more in the title fight than we all realise? Does Mercedes understand why it won in Singapore? And is Ferrari at risk of falling into a distant fourth? It's time for the latest episode of the Racing News 365 podcast. Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Racing News 365 podcast, looking back at the Singapore Grand Prix. From Racing News 365, my name is Nick Golding, and I'm delighted to be joined, as always, by the dynamic duo. That is 2023 Young Journalist of the Year, Sam absolutely Coop, and the man, the myth, the almighty legend, who is not only still in Singapore, but still in the Singapore paddock. It is, of course, lead editor Ian Parks. So now, very, very quickly, for those who are watching or listening to this podcast on Monday or during the week at any point and came from our F1 update on Singapore Grand Prix Sunday, will hopefully remember that I pointed out it's a bit of a unique podcast, this one. The reason why it's unique is that the Singapore Grand Prix is one of the only podcasts of the year where we're not all recording on the same day. Typically, we will do our podcast together on a Monday of each week after a Grand Prix or a non-Grand Prix week. This time for Sam and I, it is currently 8:15 p.m. in the UK, Sunday evening, so exactly post Singapore Grand Prix. For Ian, it is 3:15 in the morning in Singapore on Monday, Ian.
Can you correct? It is 3:15 in the early hours of Monday morning. Quite obviously, when you cover this Grand Prix, you have to operate on a UK/European time zone. Otherwise, you just completely, for want of a better phrase, screw yourself over, to be honest, trying to adjust to that time zone whilst also trying to work to UK times. So I completely stay on a UK time zone. That's why I feel like not quite as fresh as a daisy, but I'm feeling pretty good at 3:15 in the morning. And my flight back to the UK leaves Singapore in just under 6 hours. So I'll be having a good sleep on the flight back home, that's for sure. A long flight back home, nearly 14 hours. So I got that to look forward to. But nevertheless, all good to go for this, guys. And as you can see, it is a really good backdrop as well, because that behind me is the main grandstand overlooking the pitch straight at the Marina Bay Street Circuit. And you can probably just see over my shoulder as well, the forklift trucks are doing a bit of a pack away still going on from the teams there.
The good thing is that the race is very much firmly in our minds, still very, very fresh, given that it literally happened, well, a handful of hours ago. So it's unique. It's one of the most unique podcasts we do every year. It was the same last season or last year and you were in your hotel. But anyways, let's get on with today's fun question, which is, when was the last Singapore Grand Prix to not feature any retirements? Ooh.
Okay, we've only had 8 versions of it. Well, this was the 9th. Well, there was no safety car last year, so was it last year? No.
No.
It wasn't the year before, because George stuck it in the wall. 2019?
You're going 2019. Ian, any guess?
Or never?
I was going to, never.
Ian's right. It was a trick question. Yeah. Never. That was the first Singapore Grand Prix since it came onto the calendar in 2008 to not feature a single retirement. We normally see so much chaos in Singapore, but really not too much on this occasion. So on that point, Sam, I'll come to you first. What was your biggest takeaway from the Singapore Grand Prix?
Well, that realistically, when it comes to the McLarens, it's all changed, isn't it? They've won that title, they've wrapped up the Constructors, and now it is time for the gloves to come off. And they mark that first title with really kind of feels like the start of the second period of this season, the second phase, and that will be a meaner, fiercer fight probably between the two drivers at McLaren. I think Oscar, it was a bit of an awakening for him in some ways. I think he'll soften his stance when he looks back at it and goes, actually, Lando you didn't try to do that. That was completely unintentional. But he will also potentially feel that Lando was nonetheless a little bit kind of gung ho in his attempt to get kind of alongside Max and through the corner alongside him. So I think essentially it's going to be a case of the two McLaren guys just going for it now. I think it's been a moment of realization for Oscar because Lando was more aggressive at the start than I think many people would have anticipated.
Definitely more aggressive than I anticipated. And for me, quickly, my biggest takeaway is that I think McLaren have let Max Verstappen into this title fight. Yes, 63 points adrift, but as we'll get on to in a little bit later, it just feels like whatever McLaren do is just more helping Max without obviously necessarily that meaning to be the impact it has. And, Max was quite downbeat in a way, was, saying, no, I'm not in with a chance. I had to win here today. I've just got a feeling that 63 points adrift, the car worked in Singapore. That's crucial. We know it's now going to work in the final 6 races and 3 sprints. So don't rule out Max Verstappen. Ian, your biggest takeaway?
Even though Max Verstappen ruled himself out, of course.
Well, I was going to say, so you disagree with Max there, Nick.
I do. I mean, we've come to this point now in the season whereby we'd ruled Max out. Pretty much most people had ruled Max out going into the summer break with a 104-point gap to Oscar after the Dutch Grand Prix when he finished second, thanks to Lando's late retirement behind Oscar at that stage. The chasm looked unbridgeable. And now on the back of these 3 results, yes, as you and I discussed in the F1 update, literally just a few hours ago, Nick, really weird to say that.
No.
The gap is 63 points. It's still big, but there are still 174 on the table. So whilst Max might be ruling himself out, he has got a car that we now know works pretty much at all tracks now. We've seen that at Monza. We've operated well at Zandvoort for the most part before the major upgrade came with the floor on that car at Monza. So as I say, operated well at the low downforce at Monza, the reasonably low downforce at Baku, and now to a lesser or greater extent, depending on which way you want to look at it, it's operated quite well at the high downforce Marina Bay Street Circuit right behind me. So the overall package of upgrades that's been delivered over these past 3 races has performed well. That car is certainly more than a match for McLaren now, that, as we discovered from Andrea Stella on Saturday evening post-qualifying, completely stopped its upgrades quite a few races ago. There is going to be nothing new coming on that McLaren, whereas in speaking to Pierre Vacher, Red Bull's technical director, after the Singapore Grand Prix, and when I asked him whether there were going to be any more upgrades due on that Red Bull for the rest of this season, there will be. Watch this space for it. It's not over yet. 63 points could still be bridged.
Very interesting. I've got to say, I love the fact you said that the Marina Bay Street Circuit is right behind you, because it literally is right behind you. This is such a weird one. It really is. Anyways, let's go on and look back at our Singapore Grand Prix predictions, because actually quite a mixed bag for us. It was Sophia from Portugal representing the fans, and I'm going to go to highest to lowest. And Sam, turn that frown upside down. You did get the most points from the Singapore Grand Prix. You got 9 because you said Red Bull fastest pit stop, Verstappen second, Norris third. Green. 3 points for each. Red Bull did get the fastest pit stop with Yuki Tsunoda, 2.05 seconds. So 9 points for Samuel Coop. Sophia for the... Go on, Sam, quickly.
I was just going to say, I feel like I got all the working out wrong, but still the answer right somehow.
Yes.
And also, Yuki didn't finish 10th, but he still came in clutch with that pit stop. So,
That's good. Very
it's
good
only
point.
taken Sam the 18th Grand Prix of the season to actually score the most points for the race. But hey,
I
think it happened on one other occasion.
It's happened before.
It's a
rarity. I won't take that slander.
It is very much a rarity. It was Sophia representing the fans who had the second highest score with 6. 4 saying Red Bull fastest pit stop and Verstappen in second. Ian and I both only got 4. Ian, you got 4 for Red Bull fastest pit stop. You said Verstappen in third. Of course, he came second. We have the rule that if your prediction ends up being 1 above or 1 below, you get 1 point. So you got a point for saying Max in third. Similar story for me. I actually said Norris in third, which he did. So 3 points there. I said Max would win, of course, finish second. So 1 point for that, which means on the Racing News 365 predictors leaderboard. The fans remain in last on 76 points. Sam, you're in third on 84. I'm in second on 88. And Ian, you are in the lead still by 20 points on 108. Now then, we have got a lot to discuss, and time is quite literally of the essence, because if we're not quick, Ian is going to get kicked out of the media centre in Singapore, to put it quite simply. Sam,
in 35 minutes as we're talking, so
getting
I'm sure
a
they'll
move on.
give me a minute or two just to keep this going anyway.
Maybe they'll want to come on, who knows. Sam, we'll come to you first. Let's get on to McLaren. And first things first, they did seal the Constructors titles, back-to-back Constructors titles. So a few words on that, because it has been very well deserved, given that they have been across the season so far and beyond the best team on the grid.
It's been thoroughly deserved, because whilst the last few races have been quite muted by the kind of lofty heights that they had earlier in the season, they have ultimately crushed the opposition throughout the year. It's been a thoroughly dominant campaign for McLaren. So yeah, very much earned and deserved by the Woking Bay squad. And yeah, I think, as I said, it's a bit of a shame that it's come at this point. They missed the opportunity in Baku. They've had a few rounds where they just haven't been where they were earlier in the campaign. And that, I guess, takes a little bit of the shine off it. Also, what happened on the first lap feels like it takes a little bit of the shine off it. And I think for me, probably the biggest takeaway of the weekend for me from McLaren, I probably should have said this at the top of the weekend, was that it feels like in some ways they still haven't learned. I was, quite shocked when you had, Lando asked on the radio, "Are you happy for Oscar to be pitted first?" It was just, have you not learned? Like, was Monza not bad enough? And then luckily Lando was like, "No, I'm pitting first." And Oscar, pitted second, gets a slow stop, which we knew Andrea Stella said was going to happen throughout the rest of the year. They've got hardware issues when it comes to pit stops, so you can kind of predict that. Lando luckily was like, "No, not doing that. I have every right to pit first." I remember one of our colleagues actually said, like, just pit Oscar first. Why even ask? No, you don't do that. The way forward, you always give priority to the driver who's ahead. And Lando had earned that. Whether or not he was overly aggressive on the first lap, he had earned the right. And he did the right thing. But McLaren needs to stop messing around with things, because had they let Oscar pit first, that, I feel, would have been intervening in the championship fight unduly. And they have really kind of staked a claim on not doing that this year. So I think that's going to be the really important bit, kind of, as we come down to kind of the crescendo of the season. But yeah, ultimately, the big kind of talking point should be just how utterly fantastic they have been this year. It's, as I said, just a shame that it's come on a weekend where there's other less favourable talking points around the scene.
It does feel a little bit like what happened, as we're going to discuss now, on lap 1, turn 3, has overshadowed, McLaren getting this title over the line, because it was very interesting hearing the radio comments from Oscar. He was furious, Ian, as we discussed, which brings us on to the first point, I think, on what is going to be, I think, quite a big discussion on lap 1, turn 3. Obviously, the stewards had a very quick look, decided, no, nothing to do, absolutely fine. McLaren as well, when Oscar asked the team, are you going to allow this? Is this effectively part of McLaren racing rules? They said, we'll look at it after the race, get your head down, and effectively saying, there's no problem, Oscar. In your eyes, was there a problem? Should they have allowed Oscar to retake the position, or was it fair game?
No, definitely should never have allowed Oscar to retake that position. I don't think that would have been right at all. And in fairness, you've got to think as well that the FIA investigated the incident. Then McLaren also reviewed the incident, and the FIA decided no further action required. The team decided on review that they saw what unfolded was basically Lando get a bump, just nudging into the back of Max Verstappen directly ahead of him through turn 3. That little bump then obviously propelled him, a little bit of a domino effect, into the side of Oscar. And of course, that stalled Oscar's momentum coming out of turn 3, which naturally led to Lando managing to grab that third place, which, as we now know, was where he took the checkered flag, because he just could not find a way past Max Verstappen in the end. No matter how hard he tried, Max, in fairness to Max, just getting briefly on him, that was a masterclass in how to defend and make your car as wide as possible around a circuit like this. But should we expect anything less of Max? But what we did see, and what was quite clear, and this is what's going to be reviewed to the nth degree by McLaren, because that's the way they go about things when they have certain incidents like this, was the fact that Oscar, normally so cool, calm, and collected, on this occasion, probably for the first time over the radio, you could argue, really lost it to a certain point, because he quite clearly felt aggrieved by what Lando had done. His message to Tom Stallard, his engineer, when Tom had turned around and told him that they'd looked at the incident, that they would not take any action during the race and they would review it further afterwards. Oscar's response was, but that's not fair. That's just not fair. If he has to avoid another car by crashing into his teammate, then that is a pretty bleep job of avoiding. So he quite clearly felt aggrieved, but he didn't have the full information at the time, bearing in mind that he wasn't told that Lando had hit Max. That then bumped him across into Oscar himself, and that led to the slow getaway out of turn, or slower than should have ordinarily been the case, getaway out of turn 3. So how is McLaren going to view this? Well, I asked, obviously, Andrea Stella the question in his post-race media session as to whether he felt that Lando's move was actually should be applauded in many respects. He'd gone for a gap that he felt was there at the time. And Andreas turned around and basically said, well, our review is going to be very detailed, very analytical, that it was perhaps too coarse of an approach, too rudimentary of an approach to suggest that, well, the gap was there, Lando should have gone for it. So they are going to ask for a higher degree of sophistication, was his wording, and detail into the reviewing of this incident. So go for it, McLaren. We'll hear what your view will be when we get to Austin for the next Grand Prix in less than 2 weeks' time.
It cannot be argued that, Oscar left the door open, left the room for Lando. Lando went for it. I'm a little bit on the fence of it, and I'll explain why. Because ultimately, Lando made contact with Max, broke his front wing end plate. Yes, it was manageable for the remainder of the race, and obviously, as a result, also made contact with Oscar. In my eyes, had that been any other lap, the fact that he made contact with 2 cars to make the overtake stick, would that have been, looked at more intently had it been any other lap than the first lap, when obviously it was more judged as simply a racing incident? Who knows? I guess it's impossible to answer that question. For me, I think Oscar has every right to be frustrated. And this goes back to what I said in my introduction and questioning, has McLaren caused its own interesting problem? And I think yes, because they appear to get involved in every little incident that happens. So we get to this point now where no matter how small or big an incident happens between Lando and Oscar, both drivers, whoever comes out worst, is immediately onto the team radio asking, come on guys, is that fair? What are you going to do about it? Is this how we go racing? You think of Monza and what happened, obviously, them asking Oscar to give the position to Lando, even though it was Lando's slow pit stop was nothing to do with Oscar. And there's been other instances, of course, over the last 18 months or so, even going back to obviously Hungary last season. And this is why I go back to the point in my biggest takeaway that I think McLaren, in the way they've gotten involved in their drivers, and Ian, I go back to the point you made during the summer of brainwashing the drivers. I go back to that. This is why I really believe McLaren are opening this door for Max, because I think Lando and Oscar are going to have another moment this season. It's bound to happen now that it's happened once. The Constructors' title is done. We're going to see something of a similar nature, perhaps even bigger. Who knows? Maybe they'll take each other out. Only time will tell. But Max is going to see this and see that there's issues in the McLaren camp quite clearly. Oscar, yes, he may now go back and review it and think, okay, it was fair game. He's going to be frustrated. One, that he left the door open that much, and 2, that McLaren quite quickly did take the side of Lando, as they did in Monza. This is going to just open the door to Max, and I think Max is probably, whilst he's frustrated, I feel, with what happened to him in Singapore, we'll get onto that in a few moments, I think Max might be licking his lips thinking, okay, these guys are going to start tripping over each other. They've never won a driver's title. McLaren hasn't managed to take a driver to a driver's title since Lewis Hamilton in 2008. How are they going to deal with this pressure? And this, for me, is all just culminating very, very nicely to go into the final 6 rounds. Sam, you got a point to add?
So with Max, I think he absolutely will capitalise on any kind of scrap he can get. And I think real power, real dominance, and we've seen this from Max in the past, is not necessarily exploiting your opponent's weaknesses. It's taking what are seen as strengths and turning those into weaknesses. And I think Max will be very good at doing that in the run-in, taking something that McLaren feel is a strength within the team of how they negotiate these problems, how they go about racing, and he will exploit that essentially. So I completely take your point there, but McLaren will also take what you have kind of labelled a problem with how their drivers are straight on the radio complaining, and there's frustration from Oscar. It all kind of bores over and it looks very uncomfortable. They would probably argue in counter to that is actually what you're seeing is a healthy, functioning racing team, and that's how they want things to go about, as by design. Andrea Stella said Oscar was only doing what we kind of asked of them, which is that you voice your opinion, you share how you're feeling, your stance on something, so we can then kind of address that at the time and come to what we feel is a measured conclusion. So I think that's what the kind of McLaren counterpoint to that will be. But ultimately, I think Lando said it best in many ways after the race in the press conference, where he kind of argued that anyone who wouldn't have gone for that opportunity, anyone who would have done anything differently on that first lap, shouldn't be racing in F1. And, if any of the drivers have different opinions, maybe you're not cut from the same cloth or you're not cut out for it. This is a dog-eat-dog world at the end of the day, both on track and off. And so I feel that Lando was right in that kind of stance. But I do also agree with the Andrea Stella kind of argument that just mindlessly going for a gap is coarse and, to use his words, maybe, lacking a little bit of sophistication or nuance in how you go about racing.
I think it's interesting that Andrea used the word analytical as well, because ultimately this isn't a science experiment. This is a Formula One World Championship. Max will do his talking on the track. We know this. Is McLaren going to leave its talking to the boardrooms with Lando and Oscar afterwards? Only time will tell. But Ian, the final point on McLaren before we go on. So I think I've got something to add, but you can mention in a second. Go on.
Yeah. Here's a point for you. Here's a question for you guys.
Ooh.
Okay, this was between two McLaren teammates.
Yes.
If that was Max Verstappen making that move, regardless of the car that was ahead of him and the car that was to the outside, from coming from fifth on the grid and coming out of turn 3 in third, how would we have judged Max Verstappen making that move? I'm pretty confident we would say that was a great move by Max. Brilliant.
Absolutely.
Because that's what we expect from Max Verstappen. So
yes.
why should we diminish what Lando did just because it ended up with him bumping into his teammate on the outside of him? But he did, as Lando pointed out, and as Sam has rightly said as well, referring to Lando's comments in the press conference, he made a move that most ordinary racing drivers would make in seeing the opportunity ahead of them. What else was he supposed to do? Just, okay, no, it's all right, Oscar. You go. It's fine, mate. Don't worry, we're not in a championship battle. Off you go. Come
on. I like this. A bit of debate. Okay, I'll go first.
Yeah,
and in my eyes, I think, Ian, you answered your own question in the question itself by pointing out it was spicy. It was his own teammate. The number one rule in racing, you do not hit your teammate. More for the point of, ultimately, yes, we could have seen something much bigger like we saw. Nothing's going to beat Canada in terms of the extent and what happened there. I think here the bigger problem is what's it going to cause now for the final rounds? And it leads on actually to the final question I was going to ask you before we move on to Red Bull. So I'll ask that now because it actually now goes in quite nicely. It's almost like you've seen my script. But it's more the point of, we heard Max Verstappen after qualifying make the point following the small incident with Lando and the dirty air and whatnot. Max pointed out that, I'll remember this, noted. Do you feel a little bit actually Oscar's going to almost have the exact same message to himself now to Lando? I'll remember this. This has been noted.
He's made enemies of two drivers in the space of just over 24 hours as Lando Norris. So he's got Max Verstappen remembering one thing, Oscar Piastri remembering the other. It looks like Lando could be caught in the middle of be a bit of a punching bag here somewhere down the line. Who knows? But it's just, as I say, okay, you mentioned, Nick, that it was his teammate that he bumped into. Yeah. But the mitigating factor for me is he'd made the move. Potentially Max was not as quick through turn 3 as Lando might have been anticipating. He did catch him. Yes, he did bend the left front wing end plate. but that momentum just carried him into Oscar. It wasn't as if Lando, from everything that I've seen, all the video coverage, the onboards, it wasn't as if he deliberately pushed his way into Oscar. It was, as I say, this mini domino effect of he touched Lando. Lando then went across into Oscar. Oscar lost momentum. Oscar lost the position. As I say, it wasn't a forced, deliberate move to nudge Oscar out the way. That's the mitigating circumstance I'm throwing into the equation here.
It was ultimately a concertina effect. That saw Lando and Oscar make
domino,
contact.
that's what I'm saying. Mini domino.
Yeah, exactly. And Nick, you also did make the point that it was the first lap, but that is in itself a mitigating circumstance, right? We often see things dubbed a racing incident that would have been more harshly viewed later on. But also, Lando would have made the move on Oscar even if they hadn't made contact. Oscar was on the outside, on the dirty part of the track. He didn't have the same traction. He wouldn't have been able to get the same speed and acceleration out of that corner that Lando ultimately did. So, in some ways, you could argue, is it all kind of for naught? In that sense, are we looking at it from the wrong angle? And Lando said that himself in the press conference that he would have made the move. So, kind of get off my back was essentially, he actually at one point, as Lando has in the past, kind of said, I wish I hadn't because I wouldn't be here answering all these questions from you lot, referring to the media. Just shows what he thinks about the scrutiny of this incident.
And that is how you have a fair and open debate on Racing News 365. Right, we can't just talk about McLaren for this entire podcast. We've obviously spoken about Max a little bit already, so we have got one final thing to talk about on Max. And Sam, I'll come to you on this because obviously, as we've loosely discussed during the McLaren discussion, Max is very much, yes, he might say he's not 63 points adrift with a car, which is quite clearly now going to work across the final races. He's in contention still, whether he says he is or isn't. But it felt like during his post-race media in Singapore, it almost feels like there was a missed opportunity. We know he had the downshift issues, the upshift issues, balance issues, brake issues, you name it. Max seemed to have to deal with it during the Singapore Grand Prix. It did feel like, didn't it, that unless it was just me, that he sensed the missed opportunity to take even more points out of McLaren.
He absolutely did. And the very fact he started on soft tyres shows that he felt it was critical to get past George at the start of the race, and he wasn't able to do so. So in that sense, it was a missed opportunity. He also, had a missed opportunity in qualifying. He's laid the blame at Lando's feet. Whether or not that's fair, I don't know. None of us have been 6 seconds behind another F1 car in an F1 car ourselves, so we don't truly know what it's like to be in that kind of turbulent wake of a car ahead. But he will feel that it's a missed opportunity, partly in many ways because this was an unexpected opportunity as well. Heading into the weekend, you wouldn't have expected Red Bull to be as competitive as they were. And he ultimately knew that if he didn't make that move on George at the start, he wasn't going to be able to for the rest of the race. And he probably did have the pace to win if he did that. George said that. He said that. I think everyone feels that's the way forward. Ultimately, I agree with you that he's still in the fight. He will say that he isn't. He said that in the past. He said after Hungary, he's not going to win another race this season. Laurent Mekies at the time was like, well, let's not be so hasty, and was proved right, and Max was proved wrong. So whilst you need to trust what the driver is telling you and how they feel, you also can take Max's comments with a little bit of pinch of salt.
Right, let's go on to the next talking point, which is Mercedes. And Ian, I'm going to come to you with what I think is the hardest question I've ever asked anyone on the Racing News 365 podcast. Mercedes, ever since these regulations have come into effect in 2022, have hated the heat, the humid conditions. They've said it countless times. They like it when it's cold, maybe a little bit wet. George Russell was in a league of his own in qualifying in Singapore, ultimately a league of his own in the race, won by just over 5 seconds. So, Mr. Ian Parks, how did the Mercedes win in the hot and humid Singapore, and do they even understand why?
Probably not. But when you think back to George's comments post qualifying, he was almost at a loss to understand just where that performance came from, because obviously it pretty much struggled through practice. He'd had that crash in FP2 that really set him on the back foot. was not really comfortable with the car. It said that after practice on Friday, and he said that after qualifying on Saturday, that after FP3, he still wasn't comfortable. Even going through Q1, he still wasn't feeling particularly at home. And then all of a sudden, somehow, some way, that car just came alive through Q2, especially in Q3, that allowed him to get the pole position, and actually was one of the few drivers to go quicker on his second lap. He did that by 7,000ths of a second, by the way, to effectively cement the pole position. And then from pole position, yes, there would have been a nervous glance across to his left, because with the rain that came about an hour before the start, it wasn't torrential, it wasn't a downpour, but nevertheless, there was a degree of rain that, would have cleaned the dirty side of the track to a certain extent. And the dirty side of the track is that side on which Max started. Red Bull took a great strategic gamble by placing Max on soft tyres in the hope and the belief that he could get the jump on George Russell into turn one. And George himself, in the post-race press conference, turned around and said that if Max had beaten him into turn one, he would have gone on to win the race, because the performance of Max, regardless of what Max was saying about his car, and we've heard Max say that many times, but somehow he always manages to drive around these things. As I said earlier in this podcast, he produced such a defensive masterclass to keep Lando Norris at bay. Who's to say he would not have done the same thing with George Russell? So that turn one, or at least the getaway going into turn one, was crucial, because Max, as we saw, despite those soft tyres, still struggled to a certain extent, and he was more looking in his rearview mirror at what was happening with Lando and Oscar than looking ahead as to where George was, because George, even coming out of that turn 1, 2, 3, had already managed to get a good deal of distance between himself and the Flying Dutchman. And in the end, it really was Max having to look back, as I say, more than look ahead to George. And George, I know you've asked the question, how did that performance come about? But somehow it did. Mercedes got it right for once around this circuit, where it has so often struggled in the past. You have to go back to 2018 for a performance of George's ilk. And obviously that mega pole position lap from Lewis that he went on to convert into a race win on that day, but I think it was 9 seconds.
It'll be very interesting to see. Go on, Sam.
I was just to punctuate how difficult that question is that you asked Ian. In Toto Wolff's post-race press conference, he was asked to best explain how this win came about by a fellow journalist, and his immediate response was, "Well, you tell me." You get the sense that Mercedes, they are just totally at a loss as to explain this. Exactly. And you get the sense as well that Mercedes are now, they're still trying to understand things on a kind of macro level. Race by race, they're going, right, okay, let's just tackle this for what this is and see where we are, very much on a kind of micro scale at this stage, and just, can see what they can do week in, week out. And he spoke very, very well on George as well, as to how George was able to convert that pole to victory, and was kind of talking about how, 2 years ago, George made the kind of mistake that we saw from him a few times, his clash with Valtteri Bottas, Imola, I think it was 2021. There's a few instances where George has kind of managed to eradicate that from his armory suggests it's a strength, but he's managed to eradicate it. And that was the foundation, the baseline. He didn't put a wheel wrong throughout the race. And George feels he's at a championship level now, that he can compete. Toto certainly feels that. They were very much in sync with what they were saying. It's just a case of, can Mercedes now deliver that car? That's how difficult it is for Mercedes to kind of really understand where they are.
Well, it is a positive problem, at least, to try and solve, given that it comes off the back of a win. Be interesting to see how Mercedes now gets on the likes of the Circuit of the Americas, Mexico City, 2 venues which are normally pretty hot, and obviously later on in the year, in the likes of Qatar and Abu Dhabi. One team with lots of negative problems to solve is Ferrari. It's become a bit of a theme. It just, again, a weekend, which Singapore is typically a pretty good venue for Ferrari, at least history states that, and it just wasn't in the pecking order pretty comfortably 4th. They are still third in the Constructors. Quickly go through the fight for second. Mercedes in second on 325. Ferrari in third on 298. Red Bull now only 8 points adrift off Ferrari on 290. So, Sam, there's a feeling now you've got to say that Ferrari are not only at risk of falling to fourth, they could quite quickly fall to a pretty distant fourth as well.
They could do. They're in real danger at this stage, and you can kind of sense your frustration. You're like, there's a real theme. Yeah, the way you kind of enunciate that word, it feels like you're also really getting fed up with.
It's confusion. It's more confusion, though, isn't it?
Oh, completely. And Charles Leclerc was saying after qualifying, he was like, I was just at a loss as to kind of why this was happening and how we've got to this position. That he was like, I tried something stupid with the front wing. So basically, he just added loads more front wing to his SF25 to see if he could do anything with it, and it didn't really change anything. He was like, look, I'm going to have understeer or oversteer either way. It's kind of at this stage, what do you prefer? And so they are very much kind of hanging on for dear life in this fight, which is why something like Lewis's 5-second time penalty, which has lost him a position in the race classifications, it's all the more painful because you've got George winning, Kimi finishing a few positions behind him fifth. And then you've got both Ferraris. They've lost a lot of ground. You've got Max finishing in second, picking up 18 points. And they are suddenly looking like, as we discussed last week, a team that should have been in the fight for the Constructors' Championship this year, finishing almost halfway down the pecking order by the end of this year, which is a really kind of dire kind of state that the team appears to be in. Of course, they would argue that it's not as bad as it might look and that they are in the fight for second, but still, fourth is not where the team wants to be, and it's ultimately not good enough for a season's work for them.
Just finally, then, before going in.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I mean, Charles at a loss. I spoke to him, or he was in the pen anyway, and I was in front of Charles asking him questions after both qualifying and after the race as well, and he doesn't understand. The team don't understand. There's definitely not going to be any kind of never mind just a win this season. It's a question of can they even get another podium? And the fact is that they're at a loss to know what to do with that car. If Mercedes doesn't understand how that car worked in the heat around the Marina Bay Street circuit, Ferrari is at a loss to understand just what to do with its car anymore to try and get the best out of it. It shows glimpses of pace on occasion. We saw Lewis coming at a rapid rate and not okay. It was on the soft tyre compared to all the hard runners ahead of him, but nevertheless...
And he had no brakes.
And, right into the very end. But nevertheless, he was on course to finish fifth. He was making great inroads. It was a good strategy call by the team to put him on those softs to go for a second pit stop, which the majority of the other teams and drivers didn't do, right up until that point when, pretty much to emphasize just how bad it's going for Ferrari, not only did obviously Lewis have that major brake issue that cost him that position and a 5-second time penalty, but Charles as well also said that his brakes were also struggling. So it was a real compound of woes for Ferrari across another weekend where you thought that they might have had an opportunity. And now you look at the final few Grand Prix and you got to wonder, where are their points going to come from to try and just fight Mercedes and Red Bull for that second position? Because it doesn't look like it's going to happen. It looks like it's going to be between Mercedes and Red Bull. And then the way things are going, it looks like a 2-car fight with Mercedes against a 1-car fight with Red Bull, because Yuki Tsunoda was nowhere this weekend either.
Well, let's end on Yuki, because obviously a driver still without a contract for next season. And I've got a little bit of a theory. We always discuss something driver market related. So let's do that, because a couple of weeks ago, for those who are unaware, Felipe Drugovich, the 2022 F2 champion, who has been Aston Martin's reserve ever since, pretty much the driver they've always used in FP1 sessions, he's going to Formula E next season with Andretti. And he's already said, having spoken to him, that he's going to make a decision at the end of this year if he takes any roles alongside FE, like an F1 reserve, for example, but that crucially, he doesn't want anything to be a bad influence on his Formula E career. He's already reduced his role with Aston Martin. He's only doing 2 more races this season with Aston Martin to really focus on FE. So sounds like there's a good chance that relationship could be ending, but it opens a door for a reserve role at Aston Martin. We know that Red Bull, the rumours are that Isaac Hadjar will be alongside Max. I think every single outlet has reported that by now, and that Arvid Lindblad will be getting promoted from F2 to Racing Bulls, creating this battle between Yuki and Liam Lawson for the second Racing Bulls seat. Sam, I've got a theory, and I'm intrigued for your thoughts, because I know how much you love Yuki, and that if Liam gets that Racing Bulls seat, which I think would be the right decision, Fernando Alonso has said pretty recently that 2026 could be his last season. Of course, Aston Martin becoming a Honda Works team from next year. We know Honda and Yuki's relationship. Do you think we could see Yuki perhaps go into Aston Martin, replacing Felipe Drugovich as their reserve driver, continue his relationship with Honda, joining Aston Martin, to then maybe take on a race seat there for 2027?
I love the way you joined the dot. Sorry.
I know you've got some. It's some beautiful mind level kind of tapestry here to kind of get from A to B. You certainly can't rule it out, but I think it's going to be the absolute kind of last thing that Yuki wants is to take a year out from racing and sit in a reserve driver role, even if it is putting him in good stead to move over to say Fernando Alonso's seat in 2027, and partly because you need the security of a race seat to prove that you can still do it. And so, if you're on the outside looking in, it's so much more difficult to get back into a race seat. Yes, we've had Valtteri Bottas and Sergio Perez do it this year, but they're race winners. They've proven it at the front of F1. Yuki hasn't yet done that. So I think it's a very different equation. And also for Yuki, yes, he could spend that year in a reserve role at Aston Martin, but what if George Russell becomes available? What if Max Verstappen becomes available? Are Aston Martin really going to go, yeah, actually, no, we said Yuki could have the drive, so we're actually not going to do this? And obviously Lance is in the car anyway. So you just, Yuki again finds himself on the outside looking in. So realistically, if Yuki has any opportunity, he has to be going for the Alpine seat if he is the one who's going to be on the outside looking in. And ultimately, to further kind of muddy the waters, you have the looming talent now in the Red Bull stable, potentially, of Alex Dunne having left McLaren as well, which is another McLaren talking point that happened so early in the weekend that it's kind of going to be kind of brushed under the rug. Exactly. So this just kind of emphasizes just how kind of scattered and chaotic and messy the driver market can be. So it's a very interesting theory, but I think it's the kind of last thing that Yuki would really want at this stage, even with the Honda tyres at Aston Martin.
And on that note, that brings an end to this week's episode of the Racing News 365 podcast. For those watching on YouTube, please be sure to smash the like button, subscribe to the channel, so close to 25,000. Please help us out and let us know your thoughts in the comment section below of the Singapore Grand Prix and all of our talking points. For myself, Sam, and Ian, safe travels home. We'll see you next time. See you later.
Thanks, as always, for watching and listening, folks. From the Marina Bay Street Circuit, it's been a pleasure. Take care until the next time.
Thanks for joining us from my office.